Showmore 1543, Claude responded. The ancient wolf chose a servant girl over every queen in the kingdom, and the moment it knelt, 500 years of empire law shattered on a marble floor. The ancient wolf chose a servant girl over every queen in the kingdom, and the moment it knelt, 500 years of empire law shattered on a marble floor. Today we're telling the story of the girl nobody looked at, the king who came home broken from war, and the beast that remembered who kept it alive when the world walked past. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments, and stay until the end, because the choice she makes in that throne hall will cost her everything she never knew she had. The Ironfang Empire did not smell like victory. Darien Vare noticed it the moment his column crested the Ashridge Pass, and the capital spread below them in the gray morning light. The familiar iron and river stink of Varrick's Rest, but underneath it, something burnt, something hollow, the particular odor of a city that had been holding its breath for 5 years and had not quite remembered how to exhale. His mare felt it too. She stuttered a half-step beneath him, ears flattening, and he pressed one scarred knee against her flank without looking down. Easy, he said. Not to the horse, to himself. Behind him, what remained of the Ironfang campaign column stretched down the switchback road in ragged formation. 300 soldiers where 1,000 had marched out, their armor patched with mismatched metal and strips of leather cut from dead men's saddles. No drums, no banners snapping clean in the wind. The banners were there, but they hung limp and travel-stained, the silver fang on black so faded it looked like a scar on dark cloth instead of an emblem worth dying under. He had not sent word ahead about the losses. He had sent word ahead about the peace treaty, and that was the only word that mattered. Lord Commander Set rode up alongside him, which was the man's way of asking a question without asking it. Set had served Darien's father and had the permanent squint of someone who had looked into too many bright fires over too many cold campaigns. His armor was as battered as any foot soldier's. He wore it like it had grown onto his bones. We could rest the column at the Valley Garrison, Set said. Clean up. Come in tomorrow. We ride through today. The court will see what we lost. The court can look. Set was quiet for a moment, then, they already know about the Guardian. Darien said nothing. I'm saying the ceremony will be complicated. The ceremony will be what it is. Darien touched the inside of his left forearm without thinking through the leather bracer. 5 years ago, before the first campaign march, he had stood in the old vault beneath the palace and watched the Moonfang Guardian press its massive head against his chest and leave a mark there that no healer could explain. A pale silver whirl burned into the skin like old moonlight trapped under the surface. An anchor, the vault keepers had called it. A tether. The Guardian would find its own mate, its own chosen, and when it did, the mark on his arm would bind their union to the throne itself. When the wolf chooses, the Empire's future is decided, the old keeper had told him. You cannot rush it. You cannot force it. You can only be present when it happens. He had spent 5 years being present in the wrong country, fighting the wrong enemies, watching men he trusted die in wrong places. He was present now. If the Guardian doesn't choose at the ceremony, Set said carefully, the council will push the Cauldron Girl again, or the Voss daughter. They've been building cases for both houses all winter. The Guardian chooses, not the council. Darien. Set's voice dropped, and it was one of the only times in 15 years that the man had used his name without the title in front of it. The beast has been locked in the vault since you left. 5 years in the dark. Some of the keepers are saying it's half gone already, that it barely feeds, barely moves. There are men on the council who believe it's broken, that whatever makes it what it is has gone out. Darien looked straight ahead. And if they're right, Set continued, the ceremony becomes a formality. The council gets to argue bloodlines and alliance value, and the throne's future gets decided by the men who stayed home and got fat while we were bleeding in Cathara. Then we'd better hope the wolf still has some life in it. Set pulled back. He knew a closed door when he heard one. The column rode down into Varrick's Rest with the sun climbing, and the city watched from doorways and window ledges with the complicated expression of people who did not know whether to cheer or grieve. Both, probably. The dead were also coming home, just not in the same way. Bob. The palace had been cleaned for the ceremony. That was the first thing Darian registered when he walked through the great iron gates and into the main courtyard. Someone had scrubbed the old moss from between the stones and replaced every torch bracket with fresh iron that hadn't gone orange yet, and the corridors had been strung with winter sage and dried silver bark that crackled faintly in the drafts. It smelled like effort, like appearance. He washed, changed into the formal armor that his chamberlain had laid out with shaking hands and too much reverence, and spent exactly as long as necessary preparing before descending through the east passage toward the vault. The vault keeper met him at the bottom of the stairs. Old Pren, who had been vault keeper before Darian was born and who walked with a tilt from a hip that had been broken and improperly set sometime in the previous century. He had the sort of face that had moved past expression into something more permanent, a settled-in stillness that had seen too much to be surprised by most of it. "My king," a bow, short and genuine. "He knows you're here. Already. How is he?" "Alive." Pren said it the way you said something that required careful handling, which some days was not certain. The vault door was thick iron banded with silver alloy strapping, and it opened on counterweights that Darian had to help shift. The smell that hit him first was not what he expected. Not the rich animal musk of his memory, but something thinner, hay and old stone, and something underneath it, warm and medicinal. Broth. Something that smelled like broth. The chamber was large enough to stable 4 war horses. It had a stone trough for water and a raised stone platform covered in hay, and iron rings in the walls from a previous era when the guardians, there had been more than one, in the deep old histories, had been chained. The chains were gone. The rings remained. The Moonfang Guardian lay on the raised platform in a shaft of light from the single high window. It was enormous, a wolf only in the general shape of things, the way a storm was only weather in the general shape of things. Its shoulder at rest was level with Darian's chest, and its paws were splayed on the stone in the loose, boneless way of a large animal finally exhaled after a long tension. The fur was silver-white, almost luminous even in this dim light, though there were places along the ribs and haunches where it lay flat and dull against what were clearly old wounds, healed but not forgotten. It lifted its head when Darian entered. The eyes were amber gold, lit from behind by something that was not light exactly, and it looked at him with the specific quality of intelligence that was not human intelligence, but was not less than it either. Different architecture, same weight. "Hey," Darian said. The Guardian's ears moved. He crossed the vault and sat on the edge of the platform the way he had sat on the edge of campaign cots. No ceremony, no fuss, just weight going down on a surface. The wolf watched him. After a moment it laid its head back down, not at his feet exactly, but angled toward him in a way that said something without saying it. "I know," Darian said. "I know how long it was." The Guardian exhaled. Long, slow. Something rattled faintly in its chest, deep and bass, that in a smaller animal might have been a purr. In something this size, it was more like a stone wall settling. Darian looked at the ribs, the old wounds. What happened? "There was an incident," Pren said from the doorway. He had not followed all the way in. Few people did. 8 months ago. A servant boy left the outer gate unlatched. 3 men got in. We believe they were hired, though we never confirmed by whom. They had gray metal rods, the kind that disrupt shifter bonding. Darian went very still. The Guardian fought them off, killed 2. The 3rd escaped. But the gray metal leaves residue, my king. It doesn't heal clean. Pren's voice was careful. He lived. He healed more than we expected, honestly. But there were 9 nights when we were not certain. 9 nights. 9 nights. The healers did what they could, but it was... Pren stopped. There was a girl, kitchen girl, Omega, assigned to the lower scullery. She started coming to the outer gate on the 2nd night with broth she'd stolen from the kitchen pots. Nobody stopped her the first few times because nobody realized what she was doing. The keepers assumed she was running some errand. By the time we understood, the Guardian was... It had started to respond. To eat. To settle. He paused. She tore strips from her own clothing when she ran out of spare bandaging. We found them in the vault. The wolf wouldn't let anyone remove them. Darian looked at the Guardian's coat. There, along the deep right flank where the worst wound had been, The fur had grown back patchy and white bright over scar tissue, and wound into the coat there, matted gently but clearly woven in rather than simply caught, were strips of rough gray cloth. He stared at them for a long time. Where is she now? Back in the scullery, I'd assume, my king. We thanked her, gave her a meal. She didn't ask for anything. He said nothing. My king! Tonight's ceremony. The noble families have been waiting 5 years for this selection. The Cauldron delegation brought 6 daughters. The Voss house brought 4. Lord Brennan has personally guaranteed the fitness and bloodline purity of— I heard you the first time, Pren. I'm only saying that whatever the outcome tonight, the expectations of the court are— The Guardian chooses, Darien said. His voice had not changed pitch or volume. It had simply closed off, the way a fire goes out when the air is removed. That's the law. That's the only law that matters in this room. Pren was quiet. Darien sat with the wolf for another hour. Neither of them said anything. It was the most honest conversation he'd had in 5 years. The throne hall could hold 400 people standing and held all 400 tonight, which meant it smelled like perfume and politics and the particular anxiety of important people who had staked positions and were now waiting to see if the ground would hold. Candles burned in every bracket. The winter sage had been layered with dried bloom of the vale, a pale cream flower that cost more than a servant's monthly grain allotment per stem. And whoever had done the arranging had done it with the confidence of someone spending someone else's money. Darien stood on the dais. He had stood in front of armies. He had stood on the wrong side of peace negotiations with men who wanted him dead and had the resources to make it happen. None of it had felt exactly like this. The particular weight of being watched by people who were calculating his worth in the same breath as they were bowing to it. He catalogued them without expression. The noble families arranged by house along the east wall, the daughters in their presentation colors, the fathers behind them with the carefully constructed faces of men who had rehearsed this evening's reactions in advance. Lord Cauldron was enormous and red-faced and dressed in house black with silver threading that cost more than several small villages. His eldest daughter, Maris Cauldron, stood at the front of her family's line in formal white, with her dark hair dressed high, and her chin lifted at the precise angle of someone who had been told her whole life that she was the most obvious choice and had learned to agree. She was not wrong about her credentials. She was also watching the vault door at the far end of the hall, the way you watched a door you were not sure would open in your favor. Lord Voss was thinner than Cauldron and quieter about it in the way that certain kinds of danger are quieter. He had 3 daughters in the line behind his eldest, Sarah, who stood with the stillness of excellent self-control. And then there was the rest of the court. Chancellor Heth at the council table to the left of the dais, a man of 60-something years with white-gray hair cropped close and the permanently organized expression of someone whose life was made of categories. Set at parade rest in the corner, a dozen council members, vault keepers along the far wall, servants in gray livery positioned at the periphery, invisible by design. The vault door opened. The room held itself. The Moonfang Guardian came through the passage at the back with its head low and its paws crossing the black stone floor in the utterly silent way it moved when it was paying attention. The candles near the passage guttered as it passed. The air in the hall shifted. Not a breeze exactly, more like the room's ambient temperature making a quiet adjustment, as though the wolf's presence had its own gravity that rearranged the minor physics around it. It lifted its head and swept the room. Darien watched the amber gold eyes move across the assembled nobility with the quality of light that moves across a page when you're reading, purposeful, sequential, discarding. Lord Cauldron's posture changed almost imperceptibly, a straightening expectation. Maris Cauldron's chin dropped exactly a quarter inch. The Guardian walked to the center of the floor, the 400 people pulling back by half a step without coordinating it, and it stood there in the candlelight with its silver coat picking up every flame in the room until it looked like something poured rather than something that walked. It looked at the noble daughters. Then it turned and walked toward the presentation line of the Cauldron daughters and stopped in front of Maris. Lord Cauldron exhaled. The Guardian looked at her for 3 long seconds. Then it stepped back, moved on. The hall let out a breath that wasn't a breath. It went down the line. The Voss daughters, the 3 daughters of Lord Brennan's house, the twins from the Davin family who had traveled 40 miles for this evening, At each one it stopped. At each one it stepped back. Its pace was unhurried. It was not uncertain. It knew exactly what it was doing and what it was not finding, and those two things were not the same. The silence in the hall had graduated into something with more density. Not surprise yet. Confusion. The calculation in certain faces going sharp, the lines around certain mouths pulling tighter. The guardian completed the full line of noble daughters. It turned. It stood in the center of the floor again, and then it moved. Not toward the dais, not toward any of the remaining lines. It walked straight toward the servant periphery on the right wall, and the serving staff there, young men and women in gray livery who were not supposed to be part of this evening at all, startled back from its path, pressing flat against the stone wall and each other with wide eyes and very careful stillness. Except one. She had not pressed back. She was simply standing, or had been standing a moment ago, but now she had gone very still in a different way, the way a person goes still when something enormous and ambient lit is moving directly toward them, and their body hasn't decided yet what to do with that information. She was small. That was the first thing that registered about her in the hall's candlelight. Not short, exactly, but compactly built, dressed in the gray linen of the kitchen workers with a work apron still tied at the waist, because nobody had told her tonight's duties included presenting herself for anything beyond serving. Her hair was dark and pulled back without ceremony. There was a red mark on her left forearm that looked like an old burn, probably from kitchen work. Her hands, at her sides, were the hands of someone who spent them on actual labor. She was not looking at the guardian. She was looking at the floor 2 feet in front of it, not from deference, from the specific management strategy of someone who is trying very hard not to look at the thing walking directly toward her. "Lyra," she said under her breath, barely audible. Not to anyone, just the sound escaping. "Lyra, do not." The guardian stopped in front of her. She raised her eyes. She couldn't help it, and when she did, when the amber gold caught her dark gaze in that particular quality of light, something passed between them that the 400 people watching from a distance could feel but not describe. The Moonfang Guardian, the oldest living shifter bond in the recorded history of the Ironfang Empire, slowly and deliberately lowered itself to the floor. Not a collapse, not a rest. A kneel. A deliberate, formal, complete dropping of the great silver head until its chin touched the cold stone at the feet of a kitchen servant. The throne hall went absolutely silent. She stared at the wolf. The wolf did not move. "No," she said, very quietly. "No, this isn't... You can't... What is this?" Lord Cauldron's voice cut across the hall from the east wall, not a question. The sound of a man who had constructed something large and expensive and was watching it be knocked sideways by a force he had no category for. "What is this?" Maris Cauldron said nothing. Her chin had gone very flat. Chancellor Heth was on his feet, which he had not been a moment ago, and he was watching the kneeling wolf and the servant girl with an expression that Darian, looking at him across the hall, could not immediately read. It was not outrage. It was something more controlled than outrage, and that distinction sat wrong. Set had gone very still in his corner. Darian looked at the girl. She had not moved. The guardian's head was at her feet, and she had her arms wrapped around herself, and she was looking down at the wolf with an expression that was not triumph or shock or calculation. It was grief. Actual grief. The complicated kind that happens when something you quietly wanted and told yourself you couldn't have arrives in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, in front of everyone who had spent their lives not seeing you. "Someone remove the servant," Cauldron said, louder now, and there was a shuffle along the east wall as 2 of his house guards moved. "Stand down." The voice came from the dais. The guards stopped. "My king." Cauldron turned. His face was very red. "Surely you can see that this is some kind of disturbance. The animal is unwell. It was attacked not 8 months ago. Its bond sense may be corrupted, and it is clearly—" "The wolf knelt," Darian said. "The wolf is not—" "The wolf knelt." He looked at Cauldron with the patience of a man who had crossed 3 mountain ranges in 6 months and was not in any kind of mood for a lord who had spent those months indoors making alliance plans. In this hall, in front of this court, By the law my father's father wrote, and every Vare king after him upheld, that act is the bond choice. Irrevocable. Witnessed. She is a servant, Cauldron said. She is an Omega. She has no name in the registers, no house claim, no— She has the guardian, Darian said. The hall erupted. It was not chaos exactly, but it was the next thing down from it. Voices overlapping, the sound of house lords talking to each other, and to the air and to anyone in range, the high register sound of the Cauldron daughters' chaperones clustered near the wall. Chancellor Heth's voice somewhere underneath it all, saying something low and deliberate to the council members around him. Through all of it, the wolf did not move. Through all of it, the girl stood with her arms around herself and looked at the floor and did not look at the hall. Darian came off the dais. The noise did not stop, but it modified. A specific quality of attention attaching to his path as he crossed the hall floor, people moving back not quite gracefully, creating a corridor through sheer instinct. He walked toward the servant periphery. He stopped at the edge of it. She looked up. Her eyes were brown-black, darker than he'd registered from a distance, and there were circles under them that spoke of years of poor sleep and early hours and a life spent expending effort that nobody above her in the hierarchy had occasion to track. She was younger than he'd initially thought, early 20s, maybe. Her jaw was set. Whatever she was feeling, she was not going to let it be visible in this room if she could help it. "You're the one who came to the vault," he said. It was not a question. He watched her decide whether to answer it anyway. "Yes, my king." 9 nights. Something passed through her face. "The keepers told you." "Tonight." She nodded. It was a small nod, compressed, as if she was trying to give away as little motion as possible. "I heard he'd been hurt. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "The broth helps with iron poisoning, the kind gray metal leaves. My mother used it for a shifter neighbor's dog after a smelter accident. I didn't know if it would work the same way, but I—" She stopped again. "I thought it might help." "And the cloth." Her jaw tightened. "I ran out of what I had. I wasn't going to go back with nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the hall continued its controlled chaos, and he was aware of Set moving to flank without being asked, and of Chancellor Heth's eyes on his back with a quality he was going to have to think about later. "What's your name?" he said. She met his eyes. "Elira," she said. "Elira Vale. I work the 3rd scullery shift. I've been in the palace since I was 11. She said it flat, factual, with the particular cadence of someone preemptively constructing the case for their own unremarkability. "I don't have any claim on this. I know that. I don't know why he—" She looked down at the wolf. "I don't know what I did." "You came back," Darian said. 9 nights. You came back." She looked up. He had not meant to say it with whatever weight had ended up in it. He saw her hear that weight and not know what to do with it, and he watched her choose, correctly, to let it pass without addressing it. "My king." Chancellor Heth was close now, at his shoulder. "A word, privately. Before any formal— Not now, Heth. There are legal questions regarding the bond right application to a person without house standing, and if we proceed before those are— I said not now." Heth went quiet. But the silence had the quality of something being filed rather than dropped. Darian looked back at Elira Vale. She was still standing in her work apron with her arms around herself and the ancient wolf kneeling at her feet, and the 400 people of the Ironfang court were looking at her with a specific spectrum of emotions that ranged from bafflement to fury to the cold calculation of people already adjusting to a changed landscape and figuring out where new advantages could be found. She was looking at him. Not at the hall, not at the wolf, at him. "What happens now?" she said. It was quiet enough that only he could hear it. "Honestly, what actually happens now?" He opened his mouth to tell her, and that was when the vault keeper Pren came through the hall's side passage at a pace that the old man never moved, his face stripped of its permanent settled stillness into something raw, and he grabbed Set's arm before he reached the king and said something in a low, urgent rush. Set went rigid. He turned and crossed to Darian in 4 strides and leaned close. "The vault," he said. "Someone's been in the vault." Darian looked at him. While the ceremony was running, Someone bypassed the outer lock. The gray metal rods the keepers cataloged after the attack 8 months ago. Set's voice was very flat, very controlled, the voice of a man holding something heavy and not showing the weight. 4 of them are gone, and the inner vault, the relic vault, below the main chamber, Set. It's been opened, Darian, from the inside. The inner vault had 1 entrance, 1 lock, and the lock opened from the inside. Darian crossed the hall in 10 strides, Set matching him on the left, and he did not look back at the court because looking back would have told them something he was not prepared to confirm yet. Behind him, the noise of 400 opinions continued at the volume of a marketplace, and he heard Cauldron's voice rise above it in a way that carried the particular quality of a man who had decided outrage was his best remaining position. Let him outrage. The hall could manage itself for 10 minutes. "Where's Pren?" Darian said, holding the vault passage. "Who else knows?" "The 2 keepers on the inner watch. Me. You." Set's jaw was tight. "I told Pren to keep his mouth closed until you'd seen it." "The Guardian." Set glanced at him. "What about it? Is it still in the hall?" A pause. Set looked back over his shoulder. "Yes. Still with the girl." "Good." He didn't explain why that was good, and Set had enough experience to not ask. The side passage ran alongside the throne hall's eastern wall and dropped 2 short staircases before it reached the vault entry. Pren was standing at the outer gate with his hand on the iron frame in the posture of someone who has recently received very bad news and is waiting for someone else to deal with it. He was pale beneath the lamplight. The 2 inner keepers stood further back, younger men, and they had the look of people who were not sure yet whether they were in trouble for something. "Show me," Darian said. Pren pushed the outer gate and led him through. The Guardian's chamber was empty and undisturbed. The hay on the platform lay the way he'd left it an hour ago. The water trough was unchanged, the gray cloth strips still wound into the scar fur on the platform's edge. Nothing in this room had been touched. The inner vault was different. It sat below the Guardian's chamber through a low stone passage that had been sealed to Darian's knowledge since his father's reign. The passage had a door of solid black iron with a lock mechanism that Pren controlled with a key that never left his body. The key was still on Pren's person. The door was open. "The key wasn't used," Pren said, and his voice had dropped to the volume of a confession. "The mechanism turned from inside the passage, which means someone was already in there," Darian said, "before I locked it last, which was 3 days ago. My king, I checked that door every shift. I have checked it every shift for 11 years. I cannot explain how someone could have—" The gray metal rods. Darian stepped through into the relic passage and Set came close behind him. "Where were they kept?" "Cabinet on the north wall of this passage. They were logged and sealed after the attack 8 months ago. I checked the seal weekly." Pren was following, his lamp held up. "The cabinet has been opened, not broken, opened cleanly. Someone with knowledge of the mechanism." The passage was 15 feet long and widened into a small chamber at the far end. A true relic vault, shelved walls behind iron grating, things on those shelves that were old enough to have lost their original labels and been recatalogued by 3 or 4 sets of hands over the centuries. The cabinet Pren indicated was on the left wall, its door hanging open. The indentation in the padded interior, where 4 gray metal rods had sat, was clean and empty. Darian looked at the shelves beyond the grating. "Anything else missing?" Pren held the lamp higher, looked. I'll need to check against the full register. It takes time." "Start now." He looked at the 2 young keepers. "Neither of you leaves this passage until he's done." He went back through to the Guardian's chamber with Set, and he stood in the center of that room for a moment with his hands at his sides, and let what he knew arrange itself into the shape it was making. Someone had been in this passage for up to 3 days. Someone who knew the inner lock mechanics, who knew where the gray metal rods were stored, who had knowledge specific enough and access credible enough to move through the palace's most secured sublevel without triggering the vault watch. Someone who had planned this evening, who had let the ceremony happen, let the Guardian make its choice, and then— "They weren't trying to stop the ceremony," he said. Set looked at him. If they wanted to stop the selection, they would have moved before tonight, taken the wolf, or poisoned it, or blocked the ceremony on legal grounds. Cauldron's been building that case for months. He looked at the empty cabinet. They let it happen. They needed it to happen first. They needed the Guardian to choose. So they could… what? Take the bond after. Darian said nothing for a moment. The gray metal rods that had been used 8 months ago had done something specific. They had disrupted the wolf's bond sense, according to the healers, which was why the attack had been so damaging. Not a physical wound so much as a metaphysical one. They had gone for the connection, not the animal. If you sever a bond choice after it's been made, he said slowly, before it's been formalized, before the ceremony of recognition, what does the law say? Set's expression changed. The throne right reverts to the council's judgment, to the council's yes. Set's voice had gone very flat. The council selects from the established noble houses. Heth runs the council. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I need to get back in that hall, Darian said. The hall had not calmed in his absence. It had stratified. The noble factions pulling tighter around their house lords. The council members clustered near the left table in a configuration that had the look of something that had been prearranged rather than spontaneously gathered. Chancellor Heth was standing at the edge of the dais, which was not where he was supposed to stand. And when Darian came back through the main entrance, Heth's eyes found him with the quality of calculation that a good commander recognized from the other side of a field. The look of a man timing his move. Elira Vale was still on the servant's periphery. The Guardian had not moved. The gray wolf lay with its head at her feet and its amber eyes tracking the room with the patient, comprehensive awareness of something that had survived long enough to know that most threats announce themselves before they arrive. Elira was watching Darian cross the hall. Her face had arranged itself into a careful blankness that he suspected cost her some effort to maintain. She had the posture of someone who had been standing in difficult rooms for a long time and had learned that stillness was the best available protection. My king. Heth moved off the dais edge to intercept him before he reached the center of the floor. The Chancellor was smooth about it, no visible urgency, just a man redirecting a conversation with the practiced ease of 20 years in courtly mechanics. I understand there's been a matter in the vault that requires attention. In the interest of the courts, walk with me, Heth. He did not stop moving. Away from the floor. A fractional pause. Then Heth fell in beside him, and they moved toward the side alcove near the west wall where the stone columns gave a degree of acoustic separation from the rest of the hall. Set positioned himself at the alcove entrance. Not blocking, present. Tell me about the gray metal rods, Darian said. Heth's face registered nothing for the span of one breath, which was itself a kind of answer. I'm not certain what you… The 4 rods taken from the inner vault tonight, while the ceremony was running. Tell me what you know about them. My king, I was in this hall for the duration of… Heth. He turned to face the man fully and watched the Chancellor's controlled expression navigate the shift in atmosphere. Heth was 60 and experienced and had spent 4 decades learning to manage kings, starting with Darian's father. He was genuinely good at it. His tell was subtle, a very small tightening around the eyes, a fraction of a second's delay that only existed because something behind the control was making calculations. I have been gone for 5 years. I came home 3 hours ago. In those 3 hours, the Guardian chose a bondmate. 4 weapons capable of severing that bond went missing from a vault that should be impossible to access without the headkeeper's knowledge, and the inner relic chamber was opened from inside. He kept his voice even, conversational, the way you spoke to someone when you wanted the conversation to stay on your terms. So I'm asking you plainly, what do you know? I know, Heth said carefully, that the Guardian's choice tonight is going to destabilize 3 major house alliances, and potentially the treaty terms we've been negotiating with Cathara for 2 years. I know that a servant girl as Luna of the Ironfang Empire is going to require a degree of political management that's not what I asked. Heth met his eyes. The calculation was still running behind his expression. No, it isn't. He seemed to weigh something. I know that there are men on this council who have been invested in a specific outcome for this selection for a very long time. Men who finance the military campaigns with the understanding that certain alliances would be formalized once you returned. Men who are not, he paused, flexible. And you. I have served this throne for 30 years. That's not an answer either. Heth looked at him. What would you like me to say, my king? I'd like you to tell me where the rods are. Something moved behind the Chancellor's eyes. Fast, gone. I don't know where they are. But you know who took them. The silence went on 2 seconds longer than it should have. I have suspicions, Heth said finally, that I am not prepared to voice without evidence, given the political sensitivity of what I would be alleging. Then get evidence. Quickly. He held Heth's gaze. Because if those rods are used tonight, the bond right reverts to council judgment under the emergency succession clause, and I know what that clause gives you. And if that happens after what this court just witnessed, I will assume the connection is not coincidental. He let that sit. Are we clear? Heth was very still. We are clear. Good. Go back to the council table. Stay there. He left the alcove and crossed back to the center of the hall. Lord Cauldron moved to intercept him from the east wall. His face was a controlled storm. The fury was there, but he was managing it, which made it more rather than less dangerous. Behind him, Maris Cauldron stood with her hands folded and her face perfectly composed in a way that was either genuine composure or its very good imitation. My king. Cauldron planted himself with the solidity of a man who had built enough political capital to believe his weight would be respected. I have been patient. I understand the law, and I understand the guardian's right of selection, and I am not here to dispute what this court witnessed. He paused. I am here to ask whether we are seriously discussing placing an Omega servant with no house name, no documented lineage, and no formal status anywhere in the imperial registers into the position of Luna of the Ironfang Empire. That appears to be where we are, Darian said. Cauldron's jaw tightened. I have 3 daughters in this hall tonight. I know. I have 8 years of alliance investment, 2 trade agreements, and a military pledge that was conditioned on a Cauldron bond match. I know that too. Then you understand the position this creates. I understand your position perfectly. He looked at Cauldron without aggression and without apology. The wolf doesn't. Cauldron stared at him. A bond to a servant destabilizes every major house relationship in this empire. The Voss family alone has enough leverage on the grain routes to... Then the Voss family will need to make peace with a changed situation. He kept his voice level. The same as everyone else in this room. You are asking powerful people to accept an outcome that humiliates them. I am asking powerful people to accept the outcome the law produced. If the law humiliates them, that's the law's doing. He met Cauldron's eyes. And before you decide how firmly you want to push this tonight, I'd encourage you to consider that I've spent 5 years fighting a war that some of the men in this room financed and then used as leverage. I'm tired, I'm not confused, and I'm not in a negotiating posture. Cauldron held his gaze for a long beat. Then he pulled back 2 inches. Not a retreat exactly, but an adjustment. A man deciding which battle to pick. This isn't finished, he said. No, Darian agreed. It isn't. Just. Elira was looking at the wall when he reached her. Not the wolf, not the hall, the middle distance, the stone, the particular attention of someone managing a volume of input that their body hadn't finished processing. The guardian lifted its head as he approached. Its amber eyes tracked him with the specific quality it reserved for people it had decided were relevant. Veil, he said. She looked at him. Her jaw was set. Her hands, which she'd had wrapped around herself earlier, were now at her sides. A change, a decision, the body shifting from self-containment to something more exposed and more stubborn. I need to ask you something directly, he said, and I need you to answer directly. All right? In the 9 nights you came to the vault, did anyone know? Did you tell anyone? Ask anyone to cover for you? Leave a record anywhere? She held his gaze. No. I came alone. I didn't tell anyone because... A brief pause. Because I thought if someone official found out, they'd stop me. And he needed the broth, so... She said it the way you said something that felt self-evident, but you'd learned other people didn't always see as such. Did anyone follow you, any of those nights? Her brow pulled together slightly. I don't think so. I was careful. The emphasis was small, but real. The word careful carrying the specific weight of someone who had learned young that being seen in the wrong place cost something. Why? He looked at the wolf. The rods that were used to attack the Guardian 8 months ago. Someone took 4 of them from the vault tonight during the ceremony. They were in a secured passage that was locked from the outside. He watched her face. Someone was inside that passage before it was sealed. 3 days ago or more. She was quiet for a moment. So someone was already in there when the ceremony started. Her voice was flat and processing. Yes, that's... She stopped. The set of her jaw changed slightly, something going tighter. They were waiting for him to choose. He looked at her with a different quality of attention. She had arrived at the same conclusion he had, without the intermediate steps, just from the shape of what he'd told her. Yes, he said, that's what I think. So it doesn't matter that he chose me specifically. She held his gaze steadily. They just needed him to choose anyone. Then they sever it. The bond right reverts to council judgment under the emergency succession clause. And the council picks from the noble houses. Yes. She inhaled slowly through her nose. So what are you going to do? Find the rods before they're used. Find who has them. He looked at her directly. And in the meantime, keep you in sight, because if the bond has to be severed, it has to be done in proximity. You or the wolf. Something passed through her face. They'd go for him. Probably. He's the anchor. But a bond can also be broken by harming the chosen before the recognition ceremony formalizes it. She looked at the wolf. The guardian was watching her with its great amber eyes, and there was something in its gaze that was difficult to look at directly, not because it was threatening, but because it had the quality of a window that opened onto a significant distance. He came back, she said. Not to Darian. A low sound almost to herself. I kept thinking, after I stopped coming, after Pren said he was recovering, I thought, he's fine, he doesn't know it was me anyway, it's fine, she paused. I didn't think. Vale, she looked up. I need you to stay close to the wolf until I know the rods are secured. I'm a scullery servant. Not tonight, you're not. She looked at him for a moment. The expression on her face was not gratitude and not resentment and not the careful performed neutrality he'd seen from her when she was managing the room. It was something more direct than any of those things. An assessment. She was deciding something. He could see the moment she finished deciding it. All right, she said, but I need you to know something. Tell me. I didn't do those 9 nights because I wanted this. She looked at the wolf, then back at him. I did it because I couldn't not. There's a difference. He understood the difference. He understood it in a specific and personal way he was not going to address here in the middle of this hall with 400 people watching the angle of his shoulders. I know, he said. A sound from the east wall. Then another. Lord Voss had crossed a cauldron, and the two of them were deep in close conversation with their heads together in the configuration that Set had once described as the bilateral anger meeting. The council table was quiet in a way that courtly groups were never quiet unless they were working to appear so. Heth caught his eye from across the hall. The Chancellor's expression was neutral, organized, giving nothing away. He held it for 1 second before he looked down at the table. In 30 years of service, Darian had never once seen Heth look away first. He looked back at the vault passage door. It was 30 meters away, closed. 2 of his guards stood at it now, on his earlier order. It was closed and locked, and the keepers were inside doing the register count. And that was when Set appeared in the passage door, moving fast, and his face had the look of a man who had been given information that changed the shape of everything. He crossed the hall, did not shout, stopped 2 feet from Darian, and spoke at a volume only he could hear. The register check is done. And 1 item missing from the relic shelves. Set's voice was level and very careful. A gray iron amplifier rod, old manufacture, pre-Empire. The Vault catalog describes it as a device for extending the range of gray metal disruption to... He stopped. Recalibrated. Darian, with the 4 rods and the amplifier together, you don't need proximity. You don't need to be in the same room. Darian looked at the hall, the 400 people, the wolf on the floor, the girl standing next to it. Range, he said. The catalog entry says 50 meters, minimum. He looked at Chancellor Heth. still at the council table, still watching the table's surface. And then he looked up. At the gallery above the hall, the stone walkway that ran the hall's perimeter, 15 feet above the floor, used for lamp maintenance and formal event observation, accessible from the east staircase. Currently empty. Currently dark. He had not checked the gallery. Nobody had checked the gallery because nobody had thought to look up during a floor-level ceremony. The wolf's head came up from the floor. Its ears moved. Its amber gaze went sharp, pointed, angled upward. "Get her down," Darian said. He was already moving. The first gray metal rod came through the gallery darkness in a streak of dull light and hit the floor 3 feet from the Guardian in a burst of silver-gray smoke that smelled like iron and ozone, and the wolf threw its head back and made a sound that had never come from any natural animal's throat. A sound that started as a howl and ended as something older, deeper, the particular register of something that has been struck in a place that doesn't heal. Alira's voice cut through the noise. "No." And she moved toward the wolf instead of away from it. Darian hit the east staircase at a run. Behind him, the hall had broken open. The controlled architecture of a court ceremony dissolving into raw noise. 400 people compressing toward the walls as the gray smoke from the rod spread across the marble floor in a slow drift that smelled like something burning that wasn't fire. The Guardian was on its feet, head low, hackles raised in a ridge of silver white that caught the candlelight wrong, and the sound coming from its chest was continuous and deep and wrong in a way that bypassed the ears and landed somewhere more primitive. He took the stairs 2 at a time with his hand on the wall for speed and his sword already drawn because drawing it on the stairs was slow and drawing it in the dark gallery with someone who had 3 more gray metal rods would be slower. The staircase was narrow and torchless, and he went up it the way he'd gone through mountain passes in the dark. Fast, committed, not stopping to see what was on the other side. The gallery was long and stone-floored, and the lamp brackets up here were cold, unlit, which meant whoever had come up here had done it before the ceremony, had stood in the dark for the duration of the selection and waited, which required a patience and a certainty that told him something. He saw movement at the far end. 2 shapes. One moving toward the east exit, one not moving at all, slumped against the gallery rail, which meant there had been a guard up here and the guard was no longer functional. "Stop," he said. The moving shape stopped. He closed the distance at a walk, the way you walked at someone when you needed them to understand that running was not going to help them. The shape resolved into a man in plain dark clothing, not house livery, not palace gray, deliberately indeterminate. The kind of clothing chosen by someone who needed to be anywhere without being identified as from somewhere. He was young, maybe 30, with a face that had the set quality of training rather than genuine calm. Professional. The remaining rods were in a leather carry on his belt, bundled, and his right hand was holding the amplifier casing with his arm at his side in the body language of a man deciding whether to use what he was holding. "Put it down," Darian said. The man looked at him. He looked at the sword. He looked at the distance between them. He was calculating. Darian could see the calculation happening and could see the moment it arrived at the wrong conclusion. The man brought the amplifier up and Darian crossed the last 6 feet before he had it fully raised, knocked the arm aside with his left forearm, and put the sword point against the man's throat with enough pressure to make the option set very clear. The amplifier hit the floor and rolled. "Hands," Darian said. The man put his hands out, wrists up, and his face had gone from trained neutral to the specific expression of someone who had gambled on a plan that hadn't fully paid out. Not afraid. Recalculating. "Who sent you?" "Nothing. You're in the royal gallery with devices designed to sever a sacred bond during an imperial selection ceremony." He kept his voice flat, the sword pressure steady. "That's not a political offense. That's a capital one. You understand that?" Still nothing. "The men who hired you," he watched the face. "They told you there'd be a clean exit, that the timing was arranged, that you wouldn't be standing here with a sword at your throat." He paused. "Were they right about anything else?" A flicker, small but real. "What else is in motion tonight?" Darian said. The man's jaw worked. Then, "I don't know what comes after. I only know my part." "Your part was the rods. My part was the gallery. Who else has parts?" He said nothing. Darian heard boots on the staircase behind him. Set, and from the sound of it, 2 guards. He did not take his eyes off the man in front of him. "Secure him," he said when Set reached the gallery. "The amplifier is on the floor. Don't touch it with bare hands. Get Pren up here. The rods need to be recontained before anything else." He finally pulled the sword back. "And I need the name of whoever arranged access to the gallery tonight." Set grabbed the man's wrists with the practice of someone who had done it in worse conditions than this. "The gallery access log is kept by the household chamberlain, Rhett. He logs every entry and exit on ceremony nights. Get Rhett." He went back down the staircase. Below, the hall was a different shape than he'd left it. The gray smoke had dissipated, but the smell remained. Iron and ozone hanging in the candle-warm air like a stain. The Guardian was standing in the center of the floor where it had been when the rod struck, and it was upright, functional, moving its head in the slow, deliberate way of something that had been hurt in a place that didn't show. The amber eyes were tracking the room. They found Darian when he came through the staircase door and held on him with an expression that was not quite accusation and not quite relief. Something in between. The look of a creature that had learned not to expect help arriving before the damage was done. Elira was beside it. She had her hand on the wolf's flank, not petting, not comforting, just contact, her palm flat against the silver coat in the unconscious way of someone who had reached out without deciding to. There was color high in her face, and her jaw was set, and she was looking at the hall with the controlled expression of a person who had moved through fear into something harder. The hall was watching her. The noble factions had pulled further back during the chaos, and now they stood in their clusters along the walls with the expressions of people who had received information they were still organizing. Lord Cauldron was talking to his eldest daughter in a low, urgent voice. The Voss Lord was not talking to anyone. He was watching the center of the floor with the stillness that Darian had noticed in him earlier, a stillness that had the quality of patience rather than shock. A man waiting rather than a man surprised. That was wrong. That was the detail that had been wrong since the ceremony and that Darian had not yet fully examined, the Voss Lord's stillness. Cauldron's outrage had been real, raw, the genuine heat of a man whose investment had just been publicly rejected. Voss had been still from the beginning, still when the Guardian passed his daughters, still when the wolf knelt at the servant girl's feet, still when the rod hit the floor 3 feet from the Guardian. The still man in a room of loud ones was either in shock or had information. Darian crossed the hall floor, and Elira looked up as he approached, and the question on her face was direct and undecorated. "Contained," he said. "For now. The man in the gallery doesn't know the full plan." "There's more plan." "Yes." He looked at the wolf. "How is he?" "Not right," she said. "Something in the way he's holding his head, the same way he held it the second night after the attack. Like the left side of him is wrong." Her voice was steady and practical, and he had the sudden specific awareness of how many people in this hall would have needed comfort or reassurance in this same situation, and how this woman was instead giving him a diagnostic report in plain language. "He'll be moved back to the vault tonight with additional guards. I want to go with him." "You will." She looked at him with the quick assessment he was starting to recognize as her default response to unexpected accommodation, the brief recalibration of someone who had prepared for resistance. Set was back on the floor, moving to his right. "Rhett is coming," Set said. "But Darian," he lowered his voice. "The gallery access log for tonight. The Chamberlain's boy ran a copy to me. The gallery was logged open at midday. Standard lamp maintenance." "Who signed the order?" Set's face was the face of a man handing over something sharp. "Heth's office seal." The room did not change. The noise of the hall continued at its reduced post-chaos level. Darian's breathing did not change. None of the physical indicators that something had shifted registered externally because he had spent 5 years learning to control them under conditions that had required it. Inside was a different matter. He had asked Heth directly. He had looked the Chancellor in the eyes in the alcove not 40 minutes ago and said the words plainly. "I will assume the connection is not coincidental." And Heth had looked back at him with 30 years of practiced loyalty in his face and said, "We are clear," and had meant none of it, or had meant only the part that said he understood the stakes and had calculated they were worth it. That was the thing about men who had served long enough. They learned to say the things that bought time. They learned that a king who trusted them once would lean on that trust slightly too long. He had leaned on it exactly long enough for a rod to hit the floor. "Where is Heth?" he said. Set was quiet for one beat. "He was at the council table when I came back from the gallery. He wasn't there when I came down." He scanned the hall. The council table had reorganized. 3 members remained. The rest had spread to different points in the room. Heth was not among the 3 at the table. Heth was not visible anywhere in the hall. He looked at the hall's main entrance, the 2 guards at the doors. "The doors," he said. Set was already turning, who cleared the chancellor to leave. The guards' faces, from across the hall, gave him his answer before Set reached them. The particular quality of men who had been given an instruction by a face they recognized as authority and had not thought to question it. Heth was gone. Basid. The chamberlain Rhett arrived in the hall 8 minutes later, slightly breathless, with the gallery access log in his hands, and the expression of a man who had been running and also reassembling his understanding of the evening simultaneously. He was mid-40s, careful, with the organized quality of a man whose professional function was documentation. He handed Darian the log without being asked. The midday entry was there. Lamp maintenance. Heth's office seal, clean and correct. Below it, in the exit column, blank. The gallery entry had been logged open and never logged closed. Darian looked at the seal. He had seen Heth's office seal on documents for 20 years since he was old enough to understand what documents were. It looked correct. Everything looked correct. He handed the log back. Who ran this entry? Not the seal. Who physically wrote it? Rhett looked at the page. The handwriting is... He paused, looked more carefully. This is Clerk Daveth's hand. He's Heth's second. He would have handled the routine scheduling for the Chancellor's office. Find Daveth? Rhett went. Set went with him. Darian stood in the middle of the hall with the wolf on his left and the girl beside it, and the assembled nobility of the Ironfang Empire watching him manage a crisis he had not been home long enough to fully map. And he felt for the first time the specific quality of exhaustion that was not physical, the kind that came from realizing the shape of a betrayal was larger than the piece of it you were currently holding. He had assumed it was Heth with a faction. One man with a council coalition, motivated by the house alliances and the financial arrangements that had been building in his absence. That was a containable thing, a surgical problem with surgical solutions. What the gallery seal told him, what the cleaned corridor told him, what the inner vault opened from inside told him, was that this had been running for longer than tonight, longer than the ceremony. This was the product of planning that had started before he came home, which meant before they knew what the Guardian would do, which meant someone had assumed the Guardian's choice could be controlled or preempted regardless of outcome. You didn't plan for every outcome unless you had enough depth in the institution to manage every outcome. Heth had been in the palace for 30 years. Darian had been king for 8, but Heth had been in the halls for 30. Through 2 reigns, through the slow accumulation of obligations and knowledge, and the particular influence that came from being the man who organized things, who knew which clerk handled which seal, who knew which gallery logs were checked by whom. The man who knew how everything worked also knew where everything bent. Lord Voss moved. Darian saw it from the corner of his eye, the Voss Lord stepping away from his cluster with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided his timing was now. He was crossing toward Darian, and there was something in his posture that had changed from the earlier stillness into something more declarative, and he had 2 of his houseguard flanking him 2 steps back. "My king," Voss said. His voice was level. No performance of outrage, no cauldron-style heat, just the register of a man stating a position. "I've stayed quiet tonight because events moved faster than I expected. I owe you honesty." Darian looked at him. "I knew Heth had a plan," Voss said. "I did not know its specifics. I was told there would be a managed outcome to the selection, that the Guardian's choice would be guided through legal mechanisms before being finalized, and that the result would reflect stable alliances." He paused. "I agreed to that framework. I provided access to certain guild contacts who could move materials within the palace without triggering the standard inventory checks. The hall had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when the information in the air became too significant for social noise to cover. "You provided access," Darian said. His voice had not changed. "For materials." for what I understood to be legal leverage, documentation, access tools. I did not... Voss stopped. I did not know about the gray metal rods. I did not know about weapons. What did you think was in the leather carry? Voss met his eyes. I didn't ask. In any other context, in any other life, Darien might have weighed that statement as a possible truth. A man can provide assistance for a plan he understands incompletely and claim the incompleteness as distance. It was a thing people did. It was sometimes even accurate. What stood in front of him was a man who had not asked because asking would have required him to have an answer. You have a daughter in the presentation line tonight, Darien said. Sarah. Yes. And Heth's plan, if it had worked, if the bond had been severed and reverted to council judgment, your daughter's position would have been favorable. Yes, the honesty was cold, almost admirable in its cleanliness. Voss was not performing contrition, not constructing justifications. He was presenting the transaction and letting Darien assess it, which was either the act of a man who believed in accountability or the act of a man who had calculated that transparency was his best remaining leverage. I'm telling you, Voss said, because Heth is gone and whatever he's doing now, he's doing it without my knowledge, and I would rather be standing here having had this conversation than have it discovered later. Where is he? I don't know. The last time I spoke with him was an hour before the ceremony. He paused. He mentioned the inner vault. Specifically, he mentioned a second stage. A second stage. Those were the words. He didn't explain. Darien looked at the man for a long moment. Long enough that Voss's controlled expression showed the first hairline crack of genuine discomfort. You're under house arrest, Darien said. Your guards put down their weapons now. Your daughter and your household stay in the palace until this is resolved. Voss nodded. Slowly, precisely, the nod of a man accepting terms he had anticipated. Darien looked at his own guards. Take the Voss lord to the east chamber. Respectfully. He turned away. Set was back. Davith, Heth's second clerk, was with him. Young, 20-something, wearing the expression of someone who had been found somewhere he shouldn't have been, and was trying to determine whether cooperation or silence served him better. He had chosen cooperation before he'd been brought across the hall, which Darien could read in the forward lean of his posture. The inner vault, Darien said to him. He did not preface it. What is Heth doing in the inner vault? Davith swallowed. I wasn't told specifics, my king. I handled the logistics, the access orders, the gallery log. I didn't... What did Heth tell you the goal was? Davith's eyes moved to Set, back to Darien. He said the bond needed to be broken before recognition. He said with the amplifier it could be done from the relic vault, that the vault sat directly below the throne hall and at the right distance with all 4 rods activated simultaneously. He stopped. Darien felt the architecture of it lock into place. The gallery had been the distraction. The single rod fired in the hall, enough to hurt the Guardian, enough to create chaos, enough to draw him upstairs and away from the floor. While that ran, while he chased the gallery shooter, the real operation was below. The amplifier and the 4 rods deployed from directly beneath the throne hall. Same range, better angle. No one between the source and the wolf. He had cleared the vault. He had sent Pren and the keepers into the passage to do the register check. He had put guards on the vault door. And Heth had been in the palace for 30 years and knew every subpassage, every service corridor, every access point that had been built before the current guard protocols, and had never been properly sealed because nobody who had been there for 30 years and was trusted completely ever needed them sealed. The secondary entrance, Darien said, to the sublevel. Where? Davith told him. He was already running before the sentence finished. The passage entrance was in the east storage corridor, behind a rack of winter supply crates that had been moved recently. He could see the scrape marks on the floor, fresh, the crates sitting an inch off their long-established positions. The door behind them was low and iron and old, hinges blackened with decades of disuse except for the top hinge, which had been recently oiled. Not thoroughly, just enough to open quietly once. He went through with his sword in his right hand and Set at his back. The subpassage ran in the direction of the vault, and the torch that had been left on the floor 30 feet ahead was the only light. A deliberate thing, a working light rather than a marker, meaning whoever had left it was still here, still working, had not heard him coming because they believed the gallery distraction had held. At the end of the passage was a low chamber he had never been in. Heth was there. He was not alone. 2 men flanked him. Not the hired gallery shooter, different men, larger, in the plain dark clothing of the same provenance. And in Heth's hands was the amplifier casing, assembled now, active, the dull silver gray of gray metal starting to emit its characteristic flat light in the closed space of the chamber. Around it on the floor, positioned at calculated intervals, were the 4 rods. The air in the chamber had the wrong quality, thin and buzzing, the way air felt near lightning before it struck. Heth looked up. For 1 second, the organized expression on the Chancellor's face showed what was underneath it. Not guilt, not fear. Something older and colder. The look of a man who had decided on a course of action so completely and so long ago that being caught in it did not produce shame, only the operational assessment of a changed situation. "Put it down," Darian said. "My king!" Heth's voice was unchanged, exactly the voice from the alcove 40 minutes ago. "I want you to hear me out. Put the amplifier down." "The Empire needs a stable succession," Heth said. "An Omega servant cannot anchor the throne. The Guardian's bond sense has been compromised since the attack. What happened tonight is the result of a damaged animal making a choice its healthy instinct would not have made. I have served this empire for 30 years, and I am telling you that what happened in that hall tonight will destabilize every alliance, every treaty, every political arrangement that survived the war, and the empire will not. You hired men to fire weapons in my throne hall. I hired men to manage an outcome that you, exhausted from a 5-year campaign, were not equipped to manage yourself." Heth's voice remained level, even. The voice of someone who had told himself this story so many times it had become geography. "I am not your enemy, Darian. I am the man who kept this palace functioning while you were bleeding in Kethera. I am the man who kept the council from dissolving twice, and the grain routes from collapsing once, and the Cauldron Voss feud from becoming an open war that would have cost more lives than your campaign. I have done things in service of this throne that you have never been required to know." He had not put the amplifier down. The 2 men flanking him had not moved, but they were watching Set, and they were watching the door, and their weight was on the front of their feet. "Heth!" Darian heard his own voice, and it was a sound he recognized from specific moments in the campaign, the moment before things went from negotiable to not. "You have 30 seconds to put that down, or I will take it from you." The Chancellor looked at him for a long moment. The organized expression finally changed, not into remorse, not into surrender, into something that looked almost like regret about the efficiency of the situation. "You will choose her," Heth said, "because the wolf chose her and you are your father's son, and you will hold the law above the strategy, and this empire will pay for that. It will pay in years, in blood, in the slow collapse of everything I have spent 30 years constructing." 20 seconds. "I have given my life to this throne." For the first time the voice shifted, not breaking, but pressurized. The sound of something that had been compressed for a very long time finding a single exit. "I gave it when you were still a child who didn't understand what maintaining power actually cost. When it was easy, I made it easy for you. When it was ugly, I made it invisible. And you are going to throw 30 years of architecture aside for a kitchen girl and a wolf that has been half broken for 8 months, and you don't— Heth, you don't know what I've built." 10 seconds, Darian said, "and then what I do next stops being your choice." Heth looked at the amplifier in his hands. He looked at Darian. He looked at the chamber around him, the torchlight, the passage door, the 2 guards flanking him who were not enough, and who he knew were not enough because he was an intelligent man who had been intelligent his entire life, and that intelligence was now completing its final calculation. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from something that was not fear but lived in the same neighborhood, the particular tremor of a man who has committed himself completely to a position and has arrived at the moment where the position's cost becomes physical. He raised the amplifier. Darian moved. The chamber collapsed into the specific brevity of violence at close range, not the extended theater of battlefield combat, but the compressed brutal arithmetic of 2 men in a narrow room. He took the amplifier blow on the inside of his left forearm, the same scarred forearm with the bond mark beneath the bracer, and felt the gray metal contact like a struck bell resonating in bone, and closed his right hand on Heth's wrist and twisted. The amplifier hit the floor. The two flanking men moved, and Set was already between them and the sound in the chamber. For the next 30 seconds was the sound of that being resolved. When it finished, Heth was on his knees on the stone floor. Not because he'd been put there with force, he had gone down on his own, the way a structure goes when the weight it was carrying finally exceeds what it was built for. His hands were empty. His face was the face of a man who had reached the end of a very long road and found it did not end where he had believed. Darian stood over him. His left arm was ringing from the gray metal contact, and he could feel the bond mark beneath the bracer pulsing like a bruise. He looked at the man who had kept the palace functional while he bled in Kethara. He looked at the amplifier on the floor between them. He thought about the 9 nights. A girl who had come to a locked gate with stolen broth and strips of her own clothing because the animal on the other side needed them, and she could not. No strategy, no position, no 30 years of architecture. Just the inability to walk away from something that was suffering when she had the means to help. Heth had built something. He had built it for 30 years, and had built it with genuine conviction and enormous cost, and it had become, in the construction, indistinguishable from the thing it was supposed to protect. That was the thing about men who had served power long enough. They began to believe the service was the thing itself. "Take him," Darian said. Set pulled Heth to his feet. The Chancellor did not resist. He walked out of the chamber with the specific quality of a man who had stopped performing. No more organized expression, no more courtly register. Just a man at the end of a road, moving because there was no longer any reason not to. Darian picked up the amplifier from the floor and looked at it in the torchlight. Dull silver-gray metal, old manufacture, old enough to predate the current Empire's legal framework for such things. He turned it over in his hands. Then he looked at the 4 rods still positioned on the floor around him, their flat gray metal light already fading now that the amplifier was inactive. He was alone in the chamber. His left arm ached from the bond mark outward. And in that ache, in the specific resonance of gray metal contact against the spot where the Guardian had pressed its head to his chest 5 years ago, he felt, dimly and very far away, the wolf's pain. Still there, still holding. He closed his hand on the amplifier, picked up the rods one by one, and walked back through the passage toward the light. Behind him, the chamber was dark and empty, and the torchlight from the abandoned floor torch flickered against the old stone in the patterns of something that had burned a long time and was finally, at the end of its fuel, going out. Above him, through 30 feet of palace foundation, Elira Vale was standing in a throne hall full of people who had spent their lives not seeing her, with her hand on a wounded wolf's flank, waiting to see if the king she had met 3 hours ago was going to come back. He was going to come back, but when he walked back through that door, nothing in the hall would be the same shape it had been before he left it. Not the alliances, not the council, not the throne's relationship to the law that governed it, and not the particular question of who he was willing to be when being something easier was no longer an option. He had run down here as a king managing a crisis. He was going to walk back up as a man who had just finished bearing something he'd trusted for 30 years. Those were not the same thing, and the distance between them was going to cost him more than the walk back. He came back through the throne hall door carrying the amplifier in one hand and the 4 rods bundled under his left arm, and the hall looked at him with the specific expression of 400 people who had been waiting in a room together long enough that the waiting had become its own event. Set was 2 steps behind him. Behind Set, 2 guards with Heth between them. The Chancellor walking steadily, looking at nothing in particular, which was a kind of looking that meant he was looking at everything and organizing it. Elira was still beside the Guardian. She tracked Darian's path across the hall from the door to the center of the floor, and her eyes went to the amplifier, then to Heth, then back to Darian's face with the sequence of someone reading a situation faster than most people could follow it. The Guardian's head came up, not toward Darian, past him, toward Heth. The amber eyes locked on the Chancellor with the quality of a creature that did not require courts or confessions to arrive at its conclusions. Heth did not look at the wolf. He looked at the floor 3 feet in front of him, and he kept walking. Darian set the amplifier and rods on the council table. "Pren," he said. The old keeper materialized from the side wall. My king! These go back to the inner vault tonight. New seals, new locks, and I want the sub-passage entrance behind the east storage corridor sealed with permanent iron. Not locked, sealed. Pren. He waited until the man met his eyes. The vault access register gets a new protocol. 2 keeper signatures and a guard captain sign off for any entry, starting tonight. Understood. And find the guard who was in the gallery. He paused. If he's alive, get him a healer. If he's not, I want to know what he was told and by whom. Pren nodded and moved. He picked up the amplifier with a cloth from his coat. He had evidently anticipated needing it, and gestured to the young keepers, who came forward for the rods with the careful hands of people who had been briefed on what they were touching. Darian turned to the court, 400 people who had stood in a ceremonial hall for close to 2 hours and watched a selection ceremony, an unexplained smoke weapon, their king disappear twice, and their chancellor emerge from a side door under guard. They were tired and afraid, and some of them were angry, and most of them were all 3 simultaneously, which was the state most of his empire was going to be in for the foreseeable future, and there was nothing he could give them tonight that would fully resolve that. But there were things he could give them that were clear, and clarity was the thing a court needed when the landscape had just shifted. The ceremony of selection stands, he said. The hall went the kind of quiet that happens when 400 people stop talking simultaneously. The Guardian's choice is witnessed, legal, and irrevocable. The Moonfang bond right applies to Elira Vale of the Palace household. This is the law. He looked at Cauldron, at the Voss cluster, at the council table's remaining members, at each face that had a calculation running behind it. If there is a legal challenge to this outcome, it comes to me in formal petition through established process within 30 days. Anything else, he paused, will be addressed as I address the gallery tonight. Nobody spoke. Chancellor Heth is removed from his position pending formal inquiry. Lord Voss is under house restraint pending the same. Anyone who wishes to declare a connection to tonight's events before they are discovered will find the terms more favorable than they would otherwise be. That offer expires at sunrise. He scanned the room one more time. The court is dismissed. The recognition ceremony for Elira Vale will be scheduled within the week. The hall did not explode. It exhaled. A long, complicated, compressed release of something that had been held too tightly for too long, and then it began to move, slowly, in the directed way of people who had received orders and were processing the implications of those orders. Lord Cauldron looked at Darian for a long moment from across the hall. His face was unreadable, which was different from his earlier outrage, which meant the outrage had been replaced with something colder and more patient. He turned and spoke to his daughters and to the Cauldron House group, and they moved toward the main exit with the organized cohesion of people who had decided to exit rather than engage. That was not resolution. That was postponement. Darian was aware of that distinction. He went to Elira last. The hall was clearing around them, the noise dropping in increments as groups filtered through the main doors, and the servant staff began the slow professional task of restoring the hall to order. The candles had burned down a third of their height. The winter sage and bloom of the Vale gave the room a smell that would have been pleasant at the beginning of the evening, and now had the quality of anything beautiful that has been present through something difficult. She was still standing beside the Guardian. The wolf was lower now, not kneeling, but settled, its weight distributed in the careful way of an animal managing something that hurt, its amber gaze moving between Darian and the exits with the patient vigilance of something that was not going to stop watching until the room was clear. He's worse than before, Elira said. Whatever the rod did, it went in deeper when he stood up. The healers will come to the vault tonight. I know what helps more than healers. He looked at her. The broth. The broth. And quiet. And not being in a hall that smells like gray metal smoke. She had her arms around herself again, the self-containment posture, but her eyes were direct and she was not managing her expression in the way she'd been managing it an hour ago. Some layer had come off. He didn't know if it was the chaos of the evening or simple exhaustion, but whatever it was, the version of her looking at him now was less constructed. I'm sorry, he said. She blinked. For what? For the fact that the first night you have ever been publicly recognized for anything, someone fired a weapon in the hall. She was quiet for a moment. Then, to his considerable surprise, something moved across her face that was almost humor, brief and dry, and gone quickly, but real. "I've had worse evenings," she said, "though not many." "That's a low bar." "Most of my evenings are." He looked at the Guardian. The wolf's eyes had settled on him and were staying there with the particular quality of animal attention that has no social component. It was not performing watchfulness, it was simply watching. And what it was reading from him, he could not say. He felt the bond mark on his forearm pulse once, faint, like a word spoken in a room that had mostly gone quiet. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. The recognition ceremony in a week. The formal one. It will be public. The court will be there, the House Lords, the treaty observers. And some of the people in that room are going to come because they want to watch it fail, or because they have legal petitions prepared to challenge the bond right, or because they want to read the political landscape and find the new pressure points." He looked at her directly. "It will not be a comfortable event. I've been invisible in this palace for 11 years, she said. "I expect uncomfortably visible is worse." "It is." "Good." The dry humor again, and then under it, more serious. "I'm not asking for comfortable. I'm asking for true." He held her gaze. She held his without the management she'd been applying earlier, and he was aware with a specific and inconvenient clarity that of the several hundred people he had spoken to in the last 6 hours, this was the only conversation in which neither participant was performing. "Then I can give you true," he said. But he did not sleep. There was a great deal to do in the hours that followed the dismissed court. Heth to the secure East Chamber with the formal arrest documentation that Set drafted before midnight, Voss's house restraint confirmed and logged, the gallery shooter transferred to the lower holding cells after the healer reported he was conscious and uncooperative, Pren's new vault protocols set and signed. The subpassage sealed with iron spikes driven into the doorframe at 6 points, and the crates pushed back with the specific intention of making the entire space look undisturbed until a permanent solution could be built. He worked through it in the way he'd worked through campaign logistics. Sequentially, completely. Not moving to the next item until the current one was resolved. Set stayed with him. They did not talk about Heth beyond the operational requirements of the documentation. That conversation existed. They both knew it existed. It would happen when the Knight's immediate demands finished producing their emergencies. Around the 4th hour after midnight, Set said, "Voss's contact in the guild, the one who moved materials into the palace without triggering inventory. We need the full network before any of this goes to the Inquiry Council." "Agreed. That's going to pull names from 3 other houses." "Probably." "The Inquiry Council itself has 3 members who owe Heth favors." "I know." He signed the last of the detention documents and set it aside. "We'll build a separate inquiry panel, outside the standard council structure. I'll need names, people with clean records, and no Heth connections. Give me a list by morning. The treaty observers from Cathara are going to want a briefing. They were in the hall tonight. Schedule them for midday. I'll brief them myself." Set paused. "You've been home for 12 hours. "I know. You look like you did after the Reach campaign." "I feel better than that." "That's not a high bar either." Darian looked at him. Set's face had the quality it got at the end of long bad days. Not tired exactly, more distilled, reduced to the essential version of itself. The squint, the jaw, the absolute absence of anything decorative. "How long did you know about Heth?" Darian said. Set was quiet for 3 seconds. "I suspected. I didn't know. There's a distance between those things." "But you suspected." "He moved too smoothly when you were gone. Everything too organized, too contained. The Cauldron case, the Voss negotiations, the council consolidation. It was clean in a way that administration isn't usually clean. Clean means someone is managing outcomes, not just managing process." Set paused. "I didn't have evidence. I didn't want to bring you home from a war to a suspicion about the man running your palace." "You should have told me." "Yes," Set said simply. "I should have." It was not an apology exactly. It was something more honest than an apology. The plain acknowledgement of a man who had made a judgment call and was not going to construct a defense for it. Darian had known Set for 15 years, and he understood this was as close as the man got to contrition, and he understood that it was genuine. "Get some sleep," Darian said. 2 hours. Then back. "You're not sleeping. One of us should be functional at dawn." Bopos. 3 days passed before the first petition arrived challenging the bond right. It came from the Cauldron House lawyers, 17 pages of dense legal construction arguing that the Guardians' compromised bond sense after the gray metal attack constituted grounds for the selection to be reviewed by a panel of vault keepers and legal scholars before being formalized. The language was careful and correct, and cited 4 precedents from the Empire's legal history, all of which were real. The second petition arrived the following morning from a coalition of 6 lesser House Lords whose names Darian knew, but whose faces required a moment's effort. It argued from a different angle, the absence of Omega representation in the Luna selection statutes, suggesting the statutes had never contemplated an Omega selection, and therefore the bond right clause required interpretive expansion before application. The third was shorter and came from an anonymous source, which was not a legal petition, but a threat. Specific enough to tell him it came from someone with current intelligence about the recognition ceremony's planned location and timeline. He put it on the desk in front of Set, without comment. Set read it. "The ceremony needs to move." "The ceremony needs to happen on schedule," Darian said. "Moving it is the same as acknowledging the threat is credible." "The threat is credible." "Yes. And acting like it changes our timeline gives whoever sent it the thing they want." He looked at the page. "Triple the guard placement, full review of the hall access list. Anyone without a direct ceremonial role is out. And I want the Guardian's passage route checked at the hour before, not the day before." And Elira. He had been down to the vault twice in the 3 days. Both times she had been there, sitting on the edge of the platform with the wolf's head in her lap or against her side, talking to it in the low, steady voice she used without apparent self-consciousness. Not performing comfort, just providing it. The way you provided a thing that was needed without requiring an audience for the act. The first time he'd arrived, she'd looked up and assessed his face before she spoke, which he was beginning to understand was a consistent habit. She read the room in him before she read anything else. The second time she hadn't looked up at all, just said, "He ate this morning," which was the most important thing and also the only thing he needed to know. "I'll talk to her today," he said. He went to the vault at midday and found her awake and cross-legged on the stone floor with the wolf lying behind her, its chin on her knee. She had a piece of cloth in her hands that she was mending by hand. Kitchen work, something gray from the scullery. Her needle moving in the practiced, unthinking way of someone doing a familiar task while their mind ran somewhere else. She put the cloth down when he sat across from her on the floor. The wolf shifted and resettled. "The recognition ceremony is in 4 days," he said. "I know. There have been 3 petitions challenging the bond right." "I heard." She looked at him steadily. "Pren told me about the Cauldron one. He seemed to think I should be worried." "Are you?" "I've been an Omega servant in an Alpha court for 11 years, she said. "Someone always has a petition. The petitions are how they tell you you're not supposed to be where you are." She paused. "I stopped letting the petitions move me a long time ago. The work was still there the next day regardless." He looked at her. "There's also a threat, anonymous, about the ceremony." She was quiet for a moment. "From the same people as the gallery." "We don't know yet." "But you think so?" "I think Heth didn't run alone. He had operational depth, the sub-passage access, the guild contacts Voss provided, the gallery logistics. That doesn't dissolve because Heth is in a cell. The people who invested in his outcome are still invested, and they haven't found a new mechanism yet." He looked at the wolf. "The ceremony is when they'll try again, if they're going to." She absorbed this without the performance of reaction he'd have gotten from most people. "You could delay the ceremony," she said, "until the inquiry finishes, until the network is better mapped." "I could, but you're not going to." "No." She looked at him with the direct quality. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that accurately. "Because the people sending petitions and threats are making a calculation about how much resistance constitutes a signal that the outcome can still be changed. If we delay, we confirm the calculation. If we proceed, we confirm a different one. That's the strategic reason, she said. What's the other reason? He was quiet for a moment. Outside the vault, the palace moved through its midday rhythms, distant and muffled. The wolf breathed slowly against her knee. Because you've waited long enough, he said, for the record to say your name in a way that means something. She looked at him. He watched her decide something again. The same internal process he'd watched in the throne hall. The same quality of a person choosing how much of a thing to bring into the open. I'm not doing this for the record, she said. I know. That doesn't mean the record isn't owed it. The morning of the recognition ceremony came in gray and cold, a low sky pressing the city flat. He was up before the dawn watch change and walked the hall himself before any staff arrived, moving through the candleless dark with a torch, and his sword, and the specific attention of a man who had learned to check things firsthand when the stakes were high enough. The hall was empty, clean. The brackets held new candles. The sage and bloom had been replaced. The floor showed no marks from 5 nights ago. He stood in the center of it for a long time. The bond mark on his forearm pulsed once, slow, like a tide. The guardian was awake. Somewhere below, in the vault, the wolf was awake, and had made the particular connection through the bond tether that said the king was in the hall. He pressed his hand to the bracer. Through the leather he could feel the faint warmth of the mark, not the gray metal ache from the chamber that had faded. Something older. The mark his father's world had put on him 8 years ago, and that had been quietly present through 5 years of campaign and blood and everything that had happened in the 48 hours since he came home. He thought about Heth, about 30 years of architecture, about the look on the chancellor's face in that underground chamber. Not guilt, not fear, but the exhaustion of a conviction that had been running so long it had become indistinguishable from the man himself. He had built something, Heth had said. He had meant it. The tragedy of it, if it was a tragedy, and some mornings he was not sure tragedy was the right word, was that Heth had likely built something real. He had kept real things from collapsing. He had made real sacrifices for real outcomes. And somewhere in the building he had crossed from serving the throne to believing the throne could not function without his specific service, which was the point where service became possession, and possession became everything Darien had found in that subchamber. Power did that to careful men. It did it slowly, and it did it without announcing itself, which was the thing that made it permanent by the time anyone noticed. He did not want to be a man who built things he couldn't put down. He was not sure, standing in the empty hall in the pre-dawn dark, whether he knew how to guarantee that about himself. He was sure that he was going to try, and that the trying was going to require him to be willing to look directly at the places where the building instinct ran ahead of the judgment, which was a different kind of exhausting than campaigns, but not a lesser one. The staff began arriving at the 6th hour, set at the 7th with the security deployment brief, which Darien reviewed and modified in 2 places. The treaty observers arrived from their palace quarters at the 8th hour with the organized wariness of men who were still processing a foreign court's internal crisis and were not yet sure how it affected their position. He gave them 40 minutes and plain answers and watched them leave somewhat less wary, which was the best available outcome. The noble houses arrived at the 9th hour. Cauldron came. That was notable. He had expected an absence, a formal protest, the visible statement of a house that believed attendance was implicit endorsement. Cauldron came and brought Maris and stood in the east positions with his house, and his face contained the particular expression of a man who had decided that presence was more valuable than absence, for reasons he had not yet made fully public. Voss was not present, his house arrest preventing it. His eldest son stood in the Voss position, young, early 20s, with the look of someone who had been given a role in circumstances he had not anticipated, and was managing it with more composure than his age warranted. The lesser houses filled in around them. The council members in the reconstituted positions Darien had assigned 3 days ago, the old structure temporarily dissolved and rebuilt around the 3 members with clean records. The treaty observers to the right, the vault keepers along the far wall, and the servants in their gray livery at the periphery, which today included several faces that were watching Elira Vale's position with an expression that was not exactly pride and not exactly hope, but something composed of both. The guardian entered first. It moved through the vault passage at the back of the hall, with its head higher than it had been 5 nights ago. Not fully recovered, Darian could see the slight favoring of the right stride, the careful weight distribution, but present. Functional. Its silver coat in the hall's candlelight picked up every flame the way it had at the selection ceremony and turned it into something that no purely physical explanation covered. The hall made the same half-step pullback as last time, instinctive, involuntary. The Guardian walked to the center of the floor and stood, then Elira came in. Not through the vault passage, through the main entrance, from the antechamber where she had been waiting with 2 of Darian's guard. She had been given formal clothing, not the elaborate presentation white of the noble daughters, not anything that tried to dress her into a shape that wasn't hers, but good cloth, deep gray, well-fitted, with her hair down for the first time he'd seen it, dark and straight to her shoulders. She walked into the hall the way she had stood in it 5 nights ago. Not performing, not absorbing, just moving through the space as herself, which turned out to be something that was harder to look away from than any performance would have been. The Guardian moved when she reached the center of the floor. Not kneeling this time, it crossed the distance between them and pressed its great silver head against her chest, and she put both arms around its neck and held it, and for 5 seconds neither of them moved. The hall was absolutely silent. Darian came off the dais. He crossed the floor to where she stood with the wolf, and as he reached her, she looked up, and the expression on her face was the most unmanaged thing he had seen from her yet. Not composure, not the constructed stillness, just the raw and complicated openness of someone standing inside a moment they had not let themselves want, and finding it was real. He opened his mouth to speak the formal words of recognition. And that was when the doors at the back of the hall opened. Not the main entrance, the north service doors, which had been on the restricted access list, which 3 of his guards had been positioned to hold. The doors opened and the guards were not there, and in the doorway stood 4 men in the same plain dark clothing as the gallery shooter, and what they were carrying was not gray metal rods. It was crossbows loaded with bolts that had the flat gray sheen of gray metal tips. And behind them, walking through the service door with the organized expression that had not changed from a dungeon cell to a throne hall, was Chancellor Heth. He was supposed to be in the secured east chamber. He was supposed to be behind a locked door with 2 guards and a deadbolt and the formal arrest documentation that Set had drafted before midnight 3 days ago. He was standing in the throne hall with 4 armed men and the look of someone who had not, after all, been at the end of his road, who had been making a calculation from inside a locked room about where the road led next, and who had arrived at an answer while Darian was busy confirming that the situation was contained. The Guardian pulled back from Elira and turned, its head dropped low. The ridge of silver hackles came up in the slow, terrible way of something moving past warning. Heth's eyes found Darian across the hall. "I tried to tell you," Heth said, "last time. You didn't listen." The 4 crossbows came up, and they were pointed not at Darian, they were pointed at Elira. 4 crossbows. 4 gray metal tips. All of them pointed at a woman in deep gray cloth who had not moved. Darian did not look at the bolts. He looked at Heth. The Chancellor had crossed into the hall by 6 feet and stopped there, and the 4 armed men had spread to either side of the service door in the practiced way of people who had been given positions in advance and knew them. The north service door hung open behind them. The 3 guards who had been posted there were not visible, which meant they were down or bound or worse. And the answer to how Heth had gotten out of the secured east chamber was somewhere in the same answer. He had underestimated the depth. He had found the sub-passage and the gallery and the vault contacts and had believed he was seeing the full architecture, and he had been wrong about that the way you were wrong when you cleared a building and forgot there was a floor below the one you'd checked. Heth had been in this palace for 30 years. He knew every floor. "Step away from her," Darian said. "I'm not near her?" Heth's voice was the same organized register. Not triumphant, not desperate, functional. The voice of a man running a plan. "My king, I want you to hear me very clearly. The bolts are aimed at her because she is the bond point. If she dies before the recognition ceremony is formally completed, the bond right reverts. The law is the law. You said that yourself 2 nights ago. I'm using the law. You're using hired men with weapons in my throne hall. I'm using what I have." For the first time, the organized surface showed something below it. Not the pressurized grief of the subchamber, but something leaner, colder, the register of a man who had spent 3 days in a locked room, deciding that there was nothing left to lose. I have tried to protect this empire through proper channels and through improper ones, and you have dismantled every mechanism I built. So this is what remains. Elira had not moved. The Guardian was in front of her, not blocking exactly, positioned slightly to her left with its hackles raised and its body at the angle of something preparing to move in a direction it had not yet chosen. She was looking at the crossbows with the expression of someone reading a situation, not reacting to it. Her hands were at her sides. She was breathing. Darian was aware of the hall behind him, the 400 people who had come to a recognition ceremony and were now in the second crisis event of the same week. Noble lords with no weapons, a reconstituted council with no authority over this moment, Set on the far right, and Set had a sword and a clear angle to 2 of the 4 armed men, and Set was waiting. The mathematics of the room were bad. 4 crossbows at close range against people with swords were bad mathematics regardless of skill. And the math got worse if any of the 4 fired on instinct when the swords came out, which was the probable behavior of men in a hall who had been told they were there to create leverage. Heath needed her alive for the plan to work. But the men holding the crossbows were not Heth. They were hired, which meant they had the hired man's calculation, complete the visible task, which was aim and hold, without necessarily sharing the employer's interest in restraint. Hired men got nervous in rooms that didn't resolve quickly. "What do you want?" Darian said. "The recognition ceremony does not complete today," Heth said. "The proceedings are suspended pending the legal petitions currently before the court. You announce that suspension publicly, in this hall, in front of these witnesses. You allow the Cauldron petition and the Coalition petition to go to the Scholars panel for review. The timeline is theirs to set." He paused. "In return, my men stand down. No one is hurt. We resolve this in the courts, the way it should have been resolved from the beginning. You understand what you're asking. I'm asking for the law to do its work. You fired a weapon in this hall 4 days ago. That was—" Heth stopped. "That was a failure of judgment I do not repeat. This is different. This is 4 men standing in a room, no weapons discharged, no injuries, a legal demand delivered under duress, yes, but the demand itself is legal." His voice had the quality of someone who had spent 3 days constructing the argument and believed in its architecture. "Announce the suspension. Let them go. Let the process run." Darian looked at the 4 men. They were watching him and watching Set and watching the room with the particular eye movement of professionals who were tracking threats. The crossbows had not dropped. The gray metal tips caught the candlelight in the flat way of things that absorbed rather than reflected it. He looked at Elira. She was looking back at him. Not at the crossbows. Not at Heth. At him. Her face had the directness she'd had in the vault, reading the room in him first. She gave a very small, very deliberate shake of her head. He understood it. Don't give him what he's asking for. She was not performing courage. She was making an assessment and telling him the result. He looked at the Guardian. The wolf was watching the 4 armed men with a stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of something that had stopped deciding and was waiting for a single trigger to collapse into motion. Its amber eyes moved between the crossbows and the men holding them with the specific intelligence of something that understood what the gray metal tips meant for it and had made a decision about that. The bond mark on Darian's forearm pulsed, not faint this time, clear and warm and directional, like a compass needle settling, and what it was pointing at was the woman standing 3 feet from the wolf with her hands at her sides and the Guardian's silver flank between her and the hall. He thought about the 9 nights. He thought about strips of cloth torn from her own clothing and woven into a wounded wolf's coat because she couldn't not. He thought about the way she'd said, "I'm not asking for comfortable. I'm asking for true." He thought about 30 years of architecture, about the specific exhaustion of a man who had built something magnificent and terrible and could not find the place where he'd crossed from one to the other. He thought about every man he'd commanded who had died in the belief that what they were dying for was real. He looked at Heth. "No," he said. The hall held its breath. "My king, I will not suspend the ceremony. I will not send the petitions to a panel, and I will not stand in this hall and allow a man with hired crossbows to practice the law at me." He took 1 step forward. "Put down the weapons, Heth. Last offer." Heth's face finally broke from the organized surface into something raw. You will destroy everything. I will rebuild it. You don't know how long it takes to build what I built. I know what it costs, Darian said. I watched you pay it tonight. Something moved through Heth's face. The last version of the Chancellor that lived inside the raw face. The capable one, the 30-year one. The man who had genuinely kept things from collapsing and had believed that justified everything that came after. It moved through and then it was gone. And what was left was older and smaller and not organized at all. He said something to the four men. Low. One word. The crossbow on the far left swung from Elira to Darian. Set moved. The hall broke open for the third time in a week, and this time it was faster and louder and closer than either of the previous breaks, because there were no stairs and no passages between the movement and its consequences. Set covered the distance to the far left shooter in the time it took the man to reacquire his target, and the sword came down on the crossbow arm, not on the man. Darian saw that, registered it, and the bolt discharged into the stone floor with a crack that sent gray smoke up in a plume and set the nearest candle bracket swaying. The other three held. For 3 seconds, everyone in the hall was a single decision. Darian was already moving by the second, not toward the armed men, toward Heth, who was the variable that the armed men were anchored to, whose presence was the only reason they were still holding rather than discharging everything and running. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and closed his hand on the front of Heth's formal coat and pulled him forward and set the sword flat against his throat the way he had in the gallery with the hired shooter. Tell them to put them down, he said. Heth's breath was audible, short, ragged, the breathing of a man whose body had finally caught up to the situation, regardless of what his mind was still trying to construct. He looked at Darian at a distance of 8 inches, and whatever he saw there was not the king he had served for 8 years, and managed for 8 years, and believed he understood completely. Heth. A long second. Down, Heth said. His voice had no register left, just volume. The 3 remaining crossbows lowered. Set was already at the second man, and the 2 guards who had been at the main entrance were moving through the hall toward the service door. And the hired men made the calculation that people made when the arithmetic turned completely and let the crossbows go to the floor without further persuasion. The hall exhaled again. The 3rd time this week. At some point, Darian thought, a room ran out of breath to hold, and whatever came after that was a different kind of air. He held Heth there for a moment longer, the sword against the throat and the old chancellor's ragged breathing, and 30 years of something that had been real once, and had gone wrong in the slow accumulated way of things that go wrong without a single identifiable moment of change. I'm sorry, Heth said. Very quiet. For the 2nd time, the organized expression was gone, and this version was not the cold calculating version from the chamber, and not the pressurized conviction version from the service door. This was something past both of those. I am sorry, Darian. I believed... He stopped. I believed it was the Empire I was protecting. I know, Darian said. He pulled the sword back and released the coat and stepped away. The guards took Heth. The Chancellor went with them without resistance, and his face as he walked toward the side passage was the face of a man who had nothing left to perform for, which was the most honest he had been in 30 years, and also the most broken. The hall was very quiet. Darian turned from the side passage and looked at the assembled court. The 400 faces watching him, watching the service door, watching the spot in the center of the floor where the guardian had come back to Elira and was standing with its head against her shoulder. She had her hand on the wolf's jaw. Her fingers were in the silver coat. She was not looking at the court. She was looking at the guardian with an expression that was completely private. The expression of a person in a moment with something they had been afraid to want and had now, twice in 1 week, been asked to hold. He crossed the floor. She looked up when he reached her. Are you hurt? He said. No. Her voice was steady. Are you? No. She looked at him. He looked at her. The hall watched both of them with the quality of a room that had burned through every performance and was now simply present. Do you want to finish this? He said. She held his gaze for a long beat, and he watched the thing she was deciding. The same internal process, but this time it moved faster, because some decisions, made once in truth, do not require the full deliberation the second time. Yes, she said. He turned to the court and spoke the formal words of recognition. He had not rehearsed them. He did not need to. They were old words, the oldest in the Empire's legal language, and they said, "This is the Guardian's chosen, and the Guardian's chosen stands beside the throne, and the throne acknowledges the bond is true and irrevocable and witnessed." When he finished, the hall was still quiet. Then, from the servant periphery along the right wall, someone began to clap. Not the formal court acknowledgement, just a person's two hands, plain and uncoordinated with anyone else's, the clap of someone who had forgotten to perform and was simply responding. And then another, and another from a different position, and another, until the sound moved through the hall not like a wave exactly, but like water finding the level of a space it hadn't been in before, spreading into the corners and the high brackets and the old stone that had heard 30 years of Heth's organization, and tonight held something that hadn't been planned. Elira did not look at the applause. She looked at the wolf, who had lifted its great silver head and was watching the hall with its amber eyes in the still, comprehensive way of something that had been waiting for this specific arrangement of people and things and moment for longer than any of them knew. The inquiry took 4 months. Heth's network was larger than Voss had suggested and smaller than Darien had feared, which was the best available outcome in that particular range. 11 names were added to the inquiry before it closed. 4 council members, 3 guild contractors, 2 minor house lords, 1 vault keeper's assistant, and a palace chamberlain who had been logging selective access for 2 years without being asked to explain it. The sentencing was graduated. 2 men went to the permanent cells. The rest went to various forms of exile, restriction, and the long, complicated process of rebuilding a record that would not easily recover. Lord Cauldron withdrew his legal petition 6 weeks after the recognition ceremony, the same morning that his eldest daughter Maris announced a betrothal to the heir of a Ketharan trade family, which was either a coincidence or a strategic recalculation so smooth it was nearly admirable. Darien chose to treat it as the former and keep the observation to himself. The Voss heir, managing his father's house from inside the house restraint, turned out to be a competent and considerably less calculating version of his father, and the conversations that followed the restraint period were the most straightforward Darien had with any of the major houses in the subsequent months. The Ketharan Treaty was rewritten, not from scratch. The bones of the original were sound, built on genuine mutual interest in the northern trade routes. The rewrite addressed the provisions that had been inserted in Darien's absence, the clauses that required specific alliance outcomes, the conditional language that had been designed to tie the treaty's continuation to particular marriages and house arrangements. When those clauses came out, what remained was leaner and more honest, which was better than what it replaced. The gray metal devices went back into the relic vault under 3 key protocols and a guard rotation that changed every 2 days on a schedule that only Darien and Set and a new vault keeper named Orin knew in advance. Orin was 26, came from the outer provinces, and had no prior palace connections, which were his primary qualifications. He turned out to also be very good at the work, which was the bonus. The Guardian recovered. It took 6 weeks from the recognition ceremony for the Wolf's Gate to fully level, the slight favoring of the right stride finally resolving one morning when Elira came to the vault and the wolf walked to meet her at the gate without the compensation she had been tracking. She did not announce it. She knelt on the vault floor and pressed her face into the silver coat for a long moment, and the Guardian let her, its great head draped over her shoulder with the patient tenderness of something that understood what was being expressed. Pren told Darien about it that afternoon. He did not go to the vault that day. It was not his moment. He had learned, in the months since coming home, to identify which moments were his and which ones were not, which was a skill that had not been required of him on campaigns, and was turning out to be more demanding in its way than most of what campaigns had asked. Hassan. Elira did not move into the formal Luna quarters immediately. This was her own choice, stated plainly and without apology when the Chamberlain came to discuss the transition. She moved at her own pace, which was the pace of someone who had 11 years of a particular life to reorganize, and she reorganized it with the same practicality she applied to everything else. The scullery shift was covered by a promoted servant whose competence she had spent 3 weeks quietly verifying before she stepped back from it. The kitchen staff who had worked alongside her for years were informed first and in person which was not the required protocol for anyone in her position and was entirely consistent with who she was. She changed the cruel things. That was how Darian first understood the full shape of what the bond had chosen, not the ceremony or the law or the Guardian's amber-eyed certainty, but the practical way she moved through the Empire's infrastructure and changed the things that needed changing. The Omega service protocols that had accumulated over 2 generations of neglect, the regulations that had been designed for management of people rather than for the people themselves. She did not make speeches. She did not issue formal proclamations. She identified the mechanisms, talked to the people most affected, and brought Darian the changes in specific written proposals with practical implementation timelines. In the 3rd month, she went to the outer city for the first time. Not a formal visit, not a ceremonial tour. She went with 2 guards and spent a full day in the districts that had taken the most damage from the war years. The neighborhoods where the Empire's attention had been pointed outward at Cathara and the infrastructure at home had rotted in the gap. She came back that evening with 12 pages of notes in her own hand and a specific anger in her face that was not hot-burning but the cold, sustained kind. The anger of someone who had seen what she expected to see and was going to do something about it regardless of how long it took. She showed him the notes. He read them. "This is going to take years," he said. "I know. The council will push back on the grain distribution changes. Cauldron's house has 3 of the affected storage contracts." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me not to do it?" "No," he said. "I'm telling you what it costs, so you can decide with the full information." She held his gaze. "I've been deciding with incomplete information my whole life. This is better." He gave her the council's schedule and 3 relevant legal frameworks and the name of the one council member who had worked on infrastructure reform before Heth's consolidation had removed it from the active agenda. She was in the man's office the following morning. Nearly a year after the night the Guardian knelt on a marble floor in front of a kitchen servant and changed the shape of an empire's future, Darian went to the East Garden in the early evening. It was the Rosemary Hedge Garden, which was not a formal space, a small old courtyard behind the east wing that had been planted by someone 3 reigns back and had been maintained without much intention since. The rosemary growing in the dense, unpruned way of things that have been left largely alone, fragrant and gray-green and indifferent to the palace's politics. Elira was already there. She was sitting on the low stone bench at the hedge's edge with her knees drawn up and her notes on the grain roots in her lap, which she put down when she heard him, and her face when she looked up had none of the management he'd first seen in the throne hall. It had been gone a long time now, the constructed stillness replaced by the version of her that had always been underneath it, direct and dry and capable of a humor that arrived without warning and landed exactly where it aimed. The Guardian was lying in the garden grass 3 feet from the bench. It lifted its head when Darian sat down across from Elira on the flat stone wall at the hedge's edge. The amber eyes assessed him and apparently found him acceptable, and the great head went back down. "The Northern Distribution Report is done," she said. "I left it on your desk. I saw it. Aldrin from the council said the grain storage contract renegotiation is going to take another 2 months. It always takes 2 more months. That's how Aldrin works." He looked at her. "He does it eventually." She made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite argument, but was somewhere between them, which was how she responded to palace bureaucracy as a general rule. Not defeated by it, not in denial about it, just navigating it with the particular patience of someone who had been doing difficult things slowly for a long time, and had learned that slow did not mean not. The evening light had gone the particular low gold of late autumn, pressing through the rosemary and catching the silver of the Guardian's coat in a way that made the wolf look like something out of the old Empire histories. The illustrated versions, where everything was drawn in colors that were too pure to be real. He looked at the bond mark on his forearm. He had stopped wearing the bracer over it 2 months ago. The mark was pale and complex in the evening light, the silver whorl that had been there for 8 years and had meant nothing until this year, and now meant everything he had decided to mean what he meant. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him, present, unguarded. "In the vault," he said. "Those 9 nights. When you came back the next night after the first... What was it? What made you come back?" She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, taking it seriously. He didn't look at me differently, she said, when I came in with the broth. He was half conscious, and he smelled like gray metal, and he was the most powerful thing I'd ever been in the same room with. She looked at the Guardian, and he just looked at me, like I was the same as anything else that was real. Not what I was in the hierarchy, just real. She paused. I hadn't had that in a long time. I wanted to come back to it. He sat with that. The thing about 5 years of war was that it taught you the value of certain specific experiences and their absence. The absence of being looked at like you were real. The absence of someone who saw the whole thing. The cost and the damage and the parts you didn't perform for company. And stayed anyway. He had come home looking for a throne that still made sense, and had found instead a girl with kitchen-burned hands and 9 nights of stolen broth. And in her something he hadn't known he was missing because he'd been missing it for so long it had become the baseline. The Guardian lifted its head and made the low settling sound in its chest, the bass rumble that wasn't quite a purr and wasn't quite anything else. The evening light moved on the silver coat. I claimed you in a throne hall in front of 400 people, he said. Twice, if you count the night Heth came back. I count it. This is a worse venue. She looked around at the rosemary hedge and the old stone courtyard, and the wolf lying in the autumn grass, and the low gold evening light sitting on all of it. I don't know, she said. I think it's better. He crossed the distance between the stone wall and the bench and sat beside her, and she did not move away or adjust or manage it, just settled slightly, her shoulder against his. And the Guardian's amber eyes watched them both with the ancient, uncomplicated patience of something that had already known this was where they were headed, and had simply been waiting for them to arrive. Elira Vale, he said. Darian Vare, she said. It was not the formal language. It was the private one, the two-name version that meant only what it meant between two people who had looked at each other in hard rooms and decided to keep looking. He took her hand. She let him. The rosemary moved in the evening wind, and the Guardian closed its eyes, and the Ironfang Empire went on outside the hedge in its complicated and imperfect way. The grain routes still being renegotiated, the outer cities still being rebuilt, the new council still being tested, the treaty holding in its leaner, more honest form. And inside the hedge for a little while there was just this, a woman and a man and an ancient wolf, and the quiet that exists after the storms pass, and the particular quality of an evening that has earned its stillness. Not because everything had been fixed, because enough had been faced. The wolf breathed. The rosemary held its gray-green fragrance against the cooling air. And the king who had come home from war to find that the thing he most needed to protect was not the throne, but what he was willing to become to deserve it, sat in a garden with the woman who had taught him the difference between holding power and being worth it, and for the first time in 5 years did not feel the distance between who he was and who he was trying to be. They were the same man. That was enough. That, finally, was enough.